so I'm Sydney Marshall. If you all haven't met me before, I'm a curator here with University Museums. And basically, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the virtual lecture of Wrong Place, Wrong Time, a conversation about art and identity with Julie W Chang. The exhibitions, as well as the educational programs that go along with them, would not be possible without the generous support of our donors. For this semester's exhibition, major support is provided by Arthur Klein, with additional support generously provided by the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Office of the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Shelley Taylor, Jim and Marsha Burrell, Frankie and Cal Parrott, and University Museums membership. Julie W. Chang is a San Francisco-based artist whose work investigates how identities are constructed and how misunderstandings of both self and other might be resisted, subverted, and reimagined. Chang received her MFA from Stanford University in 2007, her BA in sociology from Tufts University, and her BFA in studio art from the School of Museum and Fine Arts in 1999. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including the San Francisco Art Institute, the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery, the San Jose Museum of Art, Stanford University, Transformer Gallery in Washington, D.C., Montserrat College of Art, Tulane University, Yeditepe University in Istanbul, and now the Christian Petersen Art Museum at Iowa State University. We at Iowa State have come to know Julie's work through the terrazzo floor installation All the Way Home here on campus in Curtis Hall in the Art on Campus collection. ISU's Art on Campus collection includes 2,700 public works of art placed on the 1,900-acre core campus. The Art on Campus collection is unique among universities in the United States for its breadth, scope, and integration in curriculum and aesthetic fabric of Iowa State University. This lecture will give deeper insight into the process behind the work shown in the exhibition on campus this semester. The series that are featured in the exhibition give greater context to how Julie has used personal memories, the influence of fashion, design, and cultural norms, as well as pattern found in religion, textile, and more to build a greater understanding of how we experience our society. By learning more about Julie's body of work, our campus installation also gathers layers of meaning, and hopefully we will become more aware of how we each individually are influenced by our personal experiences and the weight of expectations that may be placed upon us. Thank you all for coming to the lecture, and finally I'll introduce our artist, Julie W. Chang.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you for all your leadership also and generosity in putting together the exhibition. I'm so grateful for all your patience and work that you did to make that happen. And I, of course, want to thank Lynette Pullman and at University Museums and David Acker at the College of Ag for inviting me almost 10 years ago to come to campus to install that project. I can't believe it's been so long. And then also, I just want to extend my personal thanks to everyone whose support and generosity made it possible for me to return to campus in this way and to share my work with the community and to have this lecture today. So thank you for joining us. But Sydney mentioned, I am interested in how identities are constructed and how misunderstandings of both self and other might be resisted, subverted, and reimagined. And I found that by using this shared language of color and pattern, I can engage in conversations about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, the aspects of our social position and power that shape our identities and access in society, conversations that might otherwise be more difficult to have. In fact, one of your students asked me recently why I make this kind of art. Why am I drawn to this subject? And I was reminded that what has become over a lifetime of working with these ideas, the only lens through which I see everything is not necessarily how everyone else sees the world as well. So today I thought I'd start by trying to answer her question because the why is what has driven my practice as an artist from the start and is at the core of all the work in the exhibition and the work I plan to share with you today. And it all started with my father and his pursuit of the American dream. So at this point, I'll go ahead and share my screen with you. So for my father, this American dream of his took on a whole nother level, was taken up a notch in 1978 when it turned into a California dream. My parents were living in a suburb outside of Chicago, where I was born just a couple years earlier when his job at Rockwell International transferred him to the space shuttle program out west. And while most immigrant families at the time settled in ethnic enclaves further inland, my father, who hated the sun, and could barely swim, chose Huntington Beach, of all places, to plant his flag. And not too long after, he had the opportunity to level up again and was one of the first to buy into a new suburban housing development, a gated community of McMansions, private pools, water elements, manicured lawns, and access to an exclusive tennis and golf club, the kind of housing model that would end up taking over the region through the 80s and 90s. Now, I would never choose this for all its artifice, but for my father, this wasn't just a housing model, it was a lifestyle model, a promise of the good life. Along with it came all the trappings and material expectations, the pressure to keep up, to acquire all the signifiers of belonging and having arrived. This included hiring an interior decorator, one who, without any irony, directed my Chinese parents towards the Ralph Lauren, Laura Ashley, English aristocratic Orientalist aesthetic that was popular at the time. So while my parents attempted to style their mass-produced Huntington Beach home after an English manner, I was playing with Barbies, memorizing every word to the soundtrack of Grease, and devouring the Sweet Valley High series. I'm an only child, so the idea of being blonde and a twin was particularly fascinating. Of course, all the while I was getting indoctrinated into what it meant to be cool, popular, and beautiful, and American. And a Southern Californian kind of American that was very specific. And very unattainable when you look like this. And even though my parents approached raising me the way they approached owning a home, meaning there was a prescribed standard, a checklist of features and attributes that if and when met would grant them some, you are American, you belong, you have arrived seal of approval. And even though all the boxes were checked, and then some, it was never enough. Because also at the time, what it was meant to be Asian or Oriental, because we were still called that back then, was also very specific. And often embarrassing and offensive. For those of you who don't know, the image in the middle is from my favorite John Hughes movie, 16 Candles. And like all the other girls at the time, I had a crush on the male lead, Jake Ryan. But I'd be more likely to have been mistaken for the Lon Duk Dong foreign exchange student character than Molly Ringwald. And that would have been the best case scenario for me. Because representations of Asian women were even more problematic, and they arguably still are. There's the virginal innocent or subservient geisha or lotus flower, the conniving or dangerous dragon lady, or the mail order bride, sex worker, and prostitute. So whichever the variation, they were and still are almost always fetishized as exotic sexual objects. So how does this all come together? Well, if you can imagine, by the age of 8, I was experiencing my first identity crisis. There's a lot of information to process and not a lot of roadmap to follow on how to find a place with all this noise. So when I started to make work, it was in part to work through some of these questions and thinking back through the anxieties, the desires, the hopes and dreams that led to this, what was essentially a really uncomfortable and at times pretty miserable situation. So how do we navigate, any of us, when put in environments that are necessarily not our own or of our choosing? The way that I began dealing with some of these issues is through looking at pattern and decoration, the way that they not only line our homes and create an environment, but embody our aspirations, our desires, our hopes. And in some cultures, they may even have stories, the narratives of loss and grief built into it as well. So it felt like a good point, a good visual point to start at and to work with in terms of talking about some of these issues that were so embedded in my life at the time and our daily lives as people in general. What you'll see here is the installation that's at the museum right now. They're wallpaper scrolls that have within them, they're printed, and then we've gone back in and hand painted certain areas. And as you spend time with them, you'll see images that are in some ways familiar in their layout and their color and form, but hidden within them are more of these narratives, are more of these specific conversations or ideas that I'm trying to push together to invite others into that conversation, as well as for me to try to make sense of them in a way that is fun and interesting. Because so much of, I think, of how we process things is how can we evolve it into something more meaningful. And a lot of that is what my work is about. So moving back in line with some of these signifiers, right, of belonging, of that English manor style home. Again, working beyond the wallpaper, the ideas of the chandelier, and especially the fact that they're in plastic was well suited to the concept in terms of, how I mentioned the artifice, the superficial material possessions that, especially as an immigrant family, felt like anchors to this promised life. And as an artist who had started primarily as a painter and printmaker, this opportunity to work three-dimensionally was well-timed in terms of the object I was able to create, as well as giving me an opening into other ways of engaging with these ideas. And one of the things that I can invite you to do as we go through some of these images is to see if the narrative that I was sharing with you earlier begins to show through. And then you might be able to pick out some of those influences and how they've made their way back into the work. So while I was using the decorative arts and thinking about my family home and the ways in which the images that we lived with and wore on our bodies and the cars that we drove, all of these ideas, the branding that we put on our, in place of our values, were so prescribed in a way by society, right? By the design factors around us, the periodicals that were in our home, whether it was Architectural Digest or Town and Country. One of the things that I noticed was the sense of style that became not just about design, but about how you lived. And one of the shows that I did was looking a little bit more at what was considered in vogue and how that circled back on itself. And for me, in the case of this series, which was based on a magazine which looked at the Silk Road style, ECATs, that were, again, popular at the time, was an opportunity for me to have a more direct conversation about consumerism and the way that culture is commodified and how one's personal story weaves into that larger conversation as well.
So Julie, in this kind of transition between the Silk Road series you have here and the series you're going to talk about next, I think there's been an interesting kind of questions from visitors that we've had in the exhibition. And I think basically, you reference your upbringing, and a lot of people are wondering basically how many of these symbols are pulled like directly from your life, and how do you kind of have this balance between your own personal experience and then how over time and through these different series, it's kind of expanded out past your own experience too.
Great, thank you. So let me continue to scroll through because this work actually speaks to that question, and even more so as we move into the next body of work. But as an example, I use often the foundation, the pattern work, the imagery that we're used to, whether it's something that you would find at the upholstery store, right, or the design shop. And within that, I create images using some of the personal memories, in this case, the My Little Pony. I don't know if you can see that. And the way that I'm creating patterns out of things that weren't normally patterns that begin to mimic that idea of innocuous pattern work, when in fact there are things, in this case Prozac pills as well, built into the fabric of the design. And as I was exploring some of these things, I've noticed over the years of working with patterns and creating patterns that there are certain ones that come and go, much in the way that they do in design and in trends. And then there are others that continue to stick because the meaning just continues to hold. And so as you follow through, I invite you to sort of pay attention if anything jumps out at you. Please feel free to ask me about them, but also ones that you see continuing to go through the body of work over the decades that's been going on, and the ones that kind of fade away. And to answer your question more specifically, Cindy, this, as we move into the Chinese, Japanese, Indian chief project that in portion is being displayed at the exhibition right now. This one in particular, I was really thinking about the idea of the other, and going back to those original slides I showed you. What were the images that I was trying to navigate through when I was figuring out identity, right? And my place within that relationship to myself and the world. What was being prescribed, right? So what were the questions of what does it mean to be a girl, a woman? What does it mean to be Oriental? What does it mean to be American? What does it even mean to be a good girl, right? So there was all these questions of performance, aspiration, desire, and I think embedded deeply in that is just anxiety, right? What if you can't meet any of those expectations, then what? So in this series, what I attempted to do was create the idea of color swatches, really laying back into this design language. And with each one of them being not just color stories, but personal narrative stories built into it, that we're working through some of the complex and difficult paradoxes and conflicts that I was struggling with in terms of the voices that were coming through from the outside world. And a lot of them go back to childhood stories, songs and games that were played that were innocent at the time, but really, as we know now, were rooted in often offensive assumptions and stereotypes about the other, about, in this case, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian chief. I don't know if you recall the clapping game, but that one really stuck with me because it was a perfect example of how when you're in a situation of needing to assimilate and get along, you often laugh at something that is actually quite uncomfortable for you. So within these images, you'll see the piano, the floor plan, thank you, have a nice day, which comes from those throwaway pink Chinese takeout bags that you'll often see in various Chinatowns, littering streets. And I was really drawn to that image in particular, and you'll see that one come up a lot because it also speaks to that docile, subservient Asian ideal of a submissive woman. So titles like Smoke Signals, Up and Away, Seen and Not Heard, Wednesday's Child, all of those taken from storybooks and songs of that were very popular. And again, part of that indoctrination that I mentioned earlier that I experienced through the 80s and 90s. Sydney, feel free to jump in, or if anyone has questions at any point.
I don't see any in the chat, but also for those watching, if you have questions as we go, put them in the chat, and I will also, I'll jump in and give them to Julie.
So thinking back to some of those earlier images, you might recognize some of those markers, those signifiers that I mentioned of belonging, of status, of aspiration, and also working out some of those, looking back at the songs and the poems that we learned and thinking back about what they really meant and where they came from. I don't know if you recall the song Turning Japanese that was popular in the 80s. Again, you know, it actually comes from a very derogative term about the squeezing of eyes that happens when someone is having an excited experience. This one's called Ticky Tacky. Follow the leader. So moving on to the evolution of working with those images that are very personal to something that was perhaps a more holistic approach to trying to think about some of these ideas, felt like a natural evolution for me. And this, I think, goes back to, Cindy, what you were asking, is that there, looking back seems to be a kind of universal process of needing to understand where one comes from and the stories that are driving one's perspective, in order then to step away from it to incorporate the perspective of others, right? To know thyself first. And having done those previous bodies of work really allowed me to dive deeply into those questions. And from there, I was able to step back in this next series and look at something more elemental, more connected. If in fact we are all always carrying with us images, ideas, pressures, what is it that we share, and how are those found throughout culture and throughout time? And one of the benefits for me of using pattern and why it's been such a good fit is because while it gives an easy entry point to talking about more difficult things, it's also so universal, something that even the simplest of shapes shows up again and again, and to me reminds us that it is, there's more likeness than there is difference. So with this show, Migration, and this installation that you see here, there's elements of it in the current exhibition. I really wanted to think more about shape and pattern and this idea of how elements, like people, are sort of on the move and in interacting with one another change. And so I created a sense of a system that guided me in terms of how these colors and shapes would evolve when they came into contact with one another, which I found later in reflection a great metaphor to, sort of the larger work that I was trying to do in terms of making sense of the conflicts that were happening in the world around me. In doing installations like this, part of what I imagine is that while the shapes themselves are moving through space and active, that the bodies that move through them, especially when it's in a public environment, activate and engage in conversation as well with the work. And so I just wanted to share this image because I had the opportunity to work with a choreographer to bring her dancers in to move within the piece. And that was a fun experiment. So you'll notice that this work is still very much connected to the previous body, but the elements are far more simplified. They are less specific. And in a way, conceptually, there's more space. There was for me in a way to re-engage with painting in a way that I hadn't had for a long time because I was so enmeshed in the storytelling or the working through of those narratives. It was necessary, but I was ready to enjoy color and line and shape and form for itself a little bit more. This next slide is going to be a detail of those 3 images, and I wanted to put them together for you so that I could share some of what I meant by these systems. It's a mathematic drawing that I was creating, this infrastructure of how there's a foundation of patterns and shapes that I set rules to, that as they move from frame to frame, changed upon interacting with one another. Doing this work felt a little bit more meditative in practice, and the way in which that it still supported kind of underlying themes of structures that guide us was still there in principle, but I was, again, just really able to enjoy the abstraction of working in this way.
You have a question in the chat, Julie. So I have one person has asked, interested to know if you see elements of the work that look forward and how you think about your work as it relates to the aspiration or the future. And kind of along with that, I know you have some of your public works of art there too. So I think how these elements relate to how you're thinking about your work, both in this series and then in your public works of art too, and how you have to kind of have different mindsets for each sets of projects.
Great. I'll try to answer both of those together, and feel free to call me back if I lose it. So one of the nice things that working in that way allowed me to do is, again, that sense of like contraction and expansion, right? And so that last bit was definitely more about expansion, kind of taking a step back from the intensity of what it was that I was looking at for so long. Making work for the public sector and public projects and site-specific places offers them very much the same thing, because to look at the narrative, the identity of the other, or for the other, it's really delightful, actually. It's not nearly as loaded and difficult and fraught. So in the case of the piece I did for the Ag College, to have visited and to incorporate the elements that are part of the environment and important to the community was something that I could do as a viewer, in a way, right? As someone who's documenting it and could then present it back. And so just show you some of the images that you have seen on campus. But for those of you who might not have the ability to do that. So the idea of environmental sustainability, the local flora and fauna, basic scientific elements that run through everything that makes organisms function, right? And in our world interact the way it does. And from there, this allows me just to go into the public section as well more, again, going back into including cultural references and really talking more about the hybridity, the things that connect us, and bringing things that are different together in a way that is beautiful. Like going back again to how so much in the beginning was about how these things are so separate and in so being very difficult to exist in. So with the Transit Center project, that the goal there was similar to the one I did for the College of Ag, which is to think about what are the elements that celebrate the community and the environment and the local organisms that that make it what it is. So poppies, hummingbirds, circles from an Indian sari, Moorish tiles. One of the wonderful things about working with patterns, again, as I mentioned before, is the fact that they exist in all cultures and throughout history. So it's a natural way of tying and weaving these things together. Because ultimately, this integration, this bringing the disparate parts together, I think, is the most satisfying part about making this kind of work. In this case, we have cherry blossoms. This is done at the San Jose Museum of Art, and lines that represent a microchip. Another nice thing about working with these public site-specific projects is how I can really use the environment and have the work not just be applied as surface, but embedded into it. In this case, this was a 1970s rec center that had been going through a remodel, but they were going to leave the raw CMU blocks that had all the staining. And one of the things that I enjoyed here was how to preserve some of that history. So a lot of these lighter elements here and the ones that are taped out for an attempt to maintain that original material quality. In this project, I had the chance to work with layers of glass that were both printed and silk screened and laminated. So for someone who had been working with patterns and layering, this physical ability to layer was a really wonderful way to explore that further. And then to, in this case, add a mural to the inside of this building that mimicked the shadows and light play that were cast by the glasswork was a great opportunity to, again, keep pushing that idea of pattern upon pattern layering that happens. In this project, the process and the fabrication method was printed tile. And in this case, because I was able to use photographic imagery, gave me the opportunity to, instead of being limited to very graphic, kind of vector-based silk-screened lines, I could embed and incorporate images of actual fabric. So I wanted to end with this amulet series because I'm currently working on it right now, and I thought that I'd give you a little window into the process. As you have at Iowa State, the first 3 that have been presented publicly of a series of 22 that I am currently working on for the larger body. And this is a series that I have been thinking about for over 5 years, and one that I didn't really have a chance to sit down and start until about 2 years ago when COVID hit. I'm just sharing you this picture because we holed up in our place in Tahoe, and I made a studio while we were isolating from the world out of shoe racks that I found on Amazon and anything else that I could have delivered to our door. But it was in that environment when there was so much unknown that I was able to finally dig into this idea that I've been sitting on for so long. Formally, they are paintings that are not too dissimilar to the ones that I have done in the past. The difference being that what you see here in this image, for example, would have possibly been close to finished in terms of the amount of imagery and layering that would have gone into it. But with this body, I really wanted to push again that sense of abstraction and weaving that I was toying with a little bit in that migration series that I showed you earlier. But this, I wanted to take it to the point at which, in a way, it failed. At the very least, things are so hidden because the process here is layer upon layers, woven, buried under resin, layers upon layers, woven again, buried under resin, and on, to the point that much of it is lost. This is imagery of work that might be halfway finished, just to give you a sense of the difference in the way I'm approaching this series. These are the three that you have on display at the exhibition right now. I don't know if you can see in these details. Let me know if you'd like me to zoom in, but there are windows down into the lower layers and parts that the resin is able to provide. Part of that same concept of creating these amulets, and again, I haven't talked too much about it, but it's this idea that all of these protective images that again can be found cross-culturally, I pulled together in a way that they become so interwoven that they're just merely fibers, that the specifics of the prayer or the symbol of the charm is not so relevant anymore. It is the meditative act of putting them together that is the purpose for the work. And then to go from that intimate, almost relic form, the small painting, to this mural, this truly wrapping of a space in a protective blanket, as it were, is what this installation that we were able to do together for the exhibition was about.
Great. If any other questions in the chat, be sure to type them in. We have a few minutes for questions. While you write your questions, I know we have a question from one of my colleagues who is also in this space quite frequently. We have a lot of different examples of media here, both in your public works of art and then in your studio works. And one of our questions is more, how do you choose the media that will fit the process or fit the kind of the concept that you're exploring, and how have you kind of changed that over time?
I really have to thank the public artwork for that, opening that up for me. While I'll just go back here a little bit. Certainly, being able to do small projects like this planted that seed of possibility, and it was really exciting to see how when the idea becomes the work itself and starts to flip, meaning if I'm criticizing or talking about decoration, and then I'm making decoration that's embedded with critical thought or difficult ideas, then there's something exciting that happens in that moment, right? Which is what's going on here as well. And then with the public work in particular, to see how so much of it can be translated, whether it's in terrazzo or glass, I think it completely opened up the idea of how I even saw myself as a painter, right? Maybe that is no longer necessary or the case, and a limit that is somewhat arbitrary. In fact, I can see, even though I didn't necessarily do it directly, the way in which that glass project may have informed my wanting to experiment with resin and creating this amulet series. Because that layering that happened, that kind of window through, excuse the pun, really was something that I don't think I could have truly imagined had I not seen it and held it myself through that architectural glass piece.
And then I guess going with the amulet series, the difference between, the smallest works of art in our installation versus, the huge wrapped mural, how do you see the layering that has a similar kind of symbols and interweaving of symbols differ between something that is so small in resin and really you can kind of hide some of the images, and how does that kind of change when you are designing for such a large scale?
Well, if anything, I think this, the piece that we did for you here, right, was an attempt to get at that really intimate work the loss and the detail that happens when things are so intricate, because when you look back at certainly something like this, right, a lot of the more public pieces, everything gets so enlarged and in your face. In fact, this transit project, when I first saw a 2-scale sample of it, I felt like a teenager who had a glass, like a mirror put up to my face to see all of my pores. And it felt really uncomfortable. And I like the idea that is happening here that I'm playing with now, which is what it means to get lost in that reliquary, in that small intimate piece. If I were to shrink myself and engage with it, what would it feel like to be overwhelmed by it in this way? And I think that that's what this begins to do. And I think it also forces the person living with it, the viewer, to spend more time with it. And the way that we do with our, the wallpaper, the fabrics in our environment, so they may be invisible to us often until something jars our attention towards it and we're forced to look.
Great. Yeah, I think it has been helpful in terms of teaching to start with one side and look at the other, and kind of the differences that people have seen has been interesting for sure. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so I think we can wrap it up unless if you have any kind of closing statements. I think that was great. It was so good to hear your more insight on all the different series that you have. For those who are in Iowa, or if you want to visit us in Ames, you could come to this exhibition all the way through July in the Christian Petersen Art Museum. We're open Monday through Friday, 10 to 4, and we have events throughout the semester as well that have special opening time. So yeah, we'd love to have you here. And then it was so great to hear from you, Julie. And yeah, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for everything.